Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to High Level Policy Dialogue for ASEAN Chairmanship 2023. Welcome to the Parallel Session 1. In this session, we will discuss the topic about recovery and rebuilding, education and training systems for future skills. To lead the discussion, please welcome on the stage Research Economist from ADBI, Dr. Daniel Suryadarma.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to the session. So my name is Daniel, I'm a research economist at the Asian Development Bank Institute. For those of you who are not, so all of you are familiar with ADB, who's headquartered in Manila. ADBI is, our office is in Tokyo, Japan, so we're the sister organization of ADB. And thank you for joining us in this session because we think it's very important, and as you know, education is the foundation of a country's economic prosperity and social development. So, welcome, and today we will have three resource persons. First, we'll have Professor Jean Grossman from Princeton, who will talk about learning recovery and learning loss from the COVID-19 school closures. And we'll have Dr. Gok Sun Ju, who will from Skills Future Singapore, who will speak about making sure that a country can be future ready in terms of the skills of the workers. And last but not least, we'll have Dr. Monica Wihardja from ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute to speak about empirical case studies from Indonesia about reskilling and upgrading worker skills. So we have 2 hours, we're going to have 3 speakers, so what we think we will do is each speaker will come up and present for about 25 minutes, and then we'll go with Q&A for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we move to the second speaker and so on. That's why there are only 2 chairs here, so I'll be sitting here for 2 hours. So before I invite Professor Grossman to come up, just some housekeeping rules. Seminar materials will be available digitally. You can simply scan the QR code in your ID card and also on the screen. See? And this will give you the presentation slides, Q&A link, so you can ask your questions there, and it will come up on the screen. And there will be evaluation forms that you can fill at the end. And the price for filling the evaluation form is you get an e-certificate. So if you like these things, you should fill and say nice things. Just kidding. We'll email you the e-certificate later. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Jean Grossman to come up and start the presentation. Please welcome her.
Hello. Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here. I was really incredibly pleased to be invited. So thank you very much for having me. Given that digitalization is the topic of this conference, it really seems that in order for digitalization to achieve the potential, countries really need to have a labor force that is educated in such a way to really be able to complement and use AI and the various powers that digitalization will give. And that was always going to be a challenging thing to do, to make sure that we've upskilled the labor force in the way that we'd like. But the pandemic made that even worse. It really hit kind of the human capital stock hard. And so what I want to talk about today is what does research tell us about how to catch students up given the pandemic hit. So what I'm going to do is relatively quickly just kind of remind us all what the pandemic did to students, and then talk about various different ways that countries can approach building back the human capital that was deteriorated. So one of the things I'm going to do that's different, that there have been many excellent summaries of what we know about education research that helps catch kids up when they're behind. But one of the things I'll want to do is to talk about the trade-offs policymakers need to think about when they go in one direction or another. So that'll be the twist that I hope I can bring. So just to remind people, between 2020 and 2023, worldwide, there was a very big hit because of the pandemic, and unfortunately a lot of excess deaths. Partly as the good news of this slide is the ASEAN nations did get hit, but less hard than others. So that's a tiny bit of good news. One of the most profound things that all countries around the world, the most profound policies that they took was to close schools during the pandemic. In this slide, this is from the World Bank, they collected data on how many days schools were fully closed during the pandemic. And the darker the color, the darker the blue, is the longer the school closure. But total school closures is not the whole story. Once schools opened back up, there were a lot of partial school closings. As outbreaks would happen, schools would close back down, they'd open, they'd go partially on trying to do hybrid learning and remote learning. And so, again, here's a graph that just shows if you combine all the number of days of total closures as well as partial or remote learning, you again see that the South Asian Pacific area did have that's more than a year's worth of school that was affected, but it was less than the other parts of the world. Now, if you look, this is the slide the World Bank put together of what was the impact of these closures. So what exactly the long-term impact will ultimately be is still under a lot of research and investigation. It's going to take some time to see what the real hit was. But as of the early 2022, this was kind of worldwide what was the effect of decreased skills. So the dark colors are where there's actual data, and then the lighter colors, so a pink is like a red, but it's a projected based on the characteristics of the country and the number of type of closures that happened in that country, what was the predicted learning loss based on countries where we do actually have data. So again, if you look in Southeast Asia, they're sort of mild to moderate learning loss that happened. So if you summarize what we've learned to date, basically the longer the school closures were, both in combination, partial closures as well as full closures, for every week of closures, you got somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 weeks of learning loss within the first year and a half. It isn't uniformly distributed across skills. So the learning loss in math was much greater than the learning loss in reading. Loss was much worse for children who were already behind pre-pandemic. It was poorer students and lower socioeconomic status students were also the most affected. And the younger the students were, the greater the learning loss. There are several things here on this slide that are somewhat concerning for economies really trying to profit from digitalization. The fact that math knowledge, fundamental math knowledge, which was really the basis for STEM learning, was the most affected is quite concerning. If you're thinking about the fact that the youngest students are the ones who are the most affected and might be affected well into the future, that's the long-term future and potential for countries. So that's a very concerning issue. And then when you look at a kind of from an equity point of view, the fact that the students who were already behind are the ones that are most affected, and poorer students are also the most affected, we have to be quite concerned about that. But it's not the whole story. As I said, new research is coming out every day about what's going on. And the constraint is really, where is their data? And this happens to be from the US because there is a lot of both test score data and very fine-grained data on different districts and the policies they took. So this picture says on one side, there's the richer districts. The students started off better. And then the arrow down is the learning loss district by district throughout all of the US of how much learning loss there was in that district. So you can see that the richer districts, there was learning loss, but the learning loss tended to be bigger in the poorer districts, but not completely. There were poor districts that did reasonably well. So this study tried to look and first brought to people's attention that income isn't the only thing that was going on, that there were other reasons why students in particular environments did worse. And their bottom line was that where COVID had its biggest effects is where you had the biggest learning effects of school closures. And why might you think that's important? Well, or why would that happen? It's because the adults around the students were very, very stressed out. They were often either they had relatives who were very sick or people who had died and had to take care of relatives. They were stressed because of economic job loss. And all of that made them less available to help their children learn during the school closures. In addition, sort of the daily environment, the daily lives of these young people were really hard hit in places where COVID hit hard. Their school experience is totally disrupted. Their social networks have been disrupted. Their parents are very stressed out. They're perhaps losing their jobs, decreased income. And all of that inhibits the ability of students to learn, to concentrate, and really absorb what instruction. And this isn't necessarily just a temporary thing, because young people who experience chronic stress for long periods of time or trauma, often it takes many years to come back in order to really have the same level of concentration. So what this slide talks about is if policymakers are trying to think about where might you target your recovery dollars, you might want to target it more towards math and reading if that's where if STEM is really where you want to grow. You might target for younger students rather than older students, because the younger students are the ones who are the most affected. But you also may want, and also with the poorer districts is where you might put more money, but also where COVID had the biggest effect. So where do you go from here? And I think my bottom line, and it's not just my research bottom line, is just reopening schools isn't going to be enough to catch up the young people to where they need to be. So Not to reinvent this was not mine. Early in the pandemic, there really was an international consortium of organizations, UNICEF, World Bank, UNESCO, USAID, Gates Foundation, many organizations came together to try to provide policy advice to countries of what to do about the pandemic. And they came up with this rapid framework where it's really trying to reach out to make sure that every child who should be in school does stay in school, because there was a huge amount of drop-off that happened, that even when schools reopened, children didn't come back. Assessing where the children were when they do come back and regularly doing assessments, prioritizing teaching the foundations, trying to increase the efficiency of instruction, including a lot of catch-up in learning, and developing the social, emotional health and well-being of children. I'm going to concentrate today on the I and the D, because that's where most of my research has concentrated. So what does this mean for schools? Well, it means that they need to ensure that children are in school and ready to learn. It means covering material that hasn't been covered before and not skipping it. And then the hardest part is somehow you need to speed up learning. And so we're going to try to increase the efficiency of instructional time and increase the absorption rate of students of that instruction. As I'll talk about, many people are trying to do that by increasing the amount of learning time, but it has to be done very wisely, and that will actually, my last couple slides will focus on that. So if you want to break it down, there are kind of three key things that policymakers and school districts and educational leaders need to think about. It's attending to students' physical and mental health or social emotional well-being. It's teaching at the right level and expanding learning time in a wise manner. I'm going to go through each of these individually. But given the budget constraints that we all face, leaders are going to have to make some very challenging choices about where to put their money and in what particular situations and what particular contexts. And I hope to bring some insight into that. I'm going to try to highlight the kind of trade-offs that are made between effectiveness and affordability, so that people can think about the feasibility of alternative policies. So the first one is, attending to the mental and physical health of children. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the physical health, because that's not my expertise, but things like providing food especially in poor parts of the country, are a very good first start. It also gets kids to show up at school more often if they're going to be fed. Their parents also make sure they show up at school if they know they're going to be fed. But one of the things that can help with on the mental health side, which is an incredibly affordable and cheap thing to do, is for schools to build strong staff-student relationships. It's something that we often jump when we think about how are we going to make up learning loss, we immediately jump to the instruction. But this is why I'm going to start first with let's think about relationships and the mental health of students. Why are relationships important? It's because without these strong relationship connections, we're not going to accelerate learning. There's a lot of research that shows that strong relationships between students and adults who really value their education is really the foundation for student engagement and learning, their sense of belonging in school, and ultimately how much they learn. And relationships are cheap to form, so you don't have to spend a lot of money to do this. So, can you see that? Yes, you can. I can't really see it. So what do you do? What can a school do that will help strengthen the relationships? The main thing is just intentionally building in time or activities that allow staff, adults, to connect with the students around especially their own goals. And what I've tried to do with all the different policies that I've talked about is look at what's the key component. If you wanted to implement that, what are kind of key components? Well, it's who are the adults they're connecting with? Well, what's the group size? What's the activity? And what kind of training do the adults get? And by effectiveness, this is if you look at how effective are, in terms of learning, are each of these dimensions. That's what so on one side, as it gets closer to the left, it's more effective on learning and less effective on the other direction. So when the relationships are formed with certified teachers, and especially their own teacher, that's when you get the biggest impact in learning. But that's not the only thing. Teachers have many things to do. You can connect to other adults in the school building or other adults outside of school, as long as they bring these adults bring a concern about how much the kids learn. It's pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but the smaller the group, so if you're doing an activity, the smaller the group, the much more likely the strong relationships will form, and ultimately learning would occur. So one-on-one is great. That's hard to do. You don't have enough adults, but smaller groups are better than larger groups. One thing that's a little, people don't think about as much is when the activities are directed by the students' goals as opposed to the adults' goals, even though you would think that it should be the adults saying, this is what you should learn, and we're going to do this, and this is good for you, actually the kids will learn, the young people will learn less than if it's motivated by their own goals. So if there's an activity because they want to do something, and the adult helps them build the skills for them to do what they want to do, they actually they learn more and they retain that knowledge longer. So who benefits? Where would you want to do this? It turns out all students benefit from stronger relationships, but especially those students who are have high levels of either environmental adversity, so places where COVID is very bad or the income impacts have been really great, or also those students who just are much more personally challenged. So within a district or within an area, it's the young people who already have academic struggles or personal struggles. So just to summarize, that schools can strengthen these relationships in a relatively inexpensive way if the leadership explicitly values the creation of relationships between the adults in the school building and the students. This can be promoted if there's a formalization of these interactions through some scheduled activity. And then providing teachers and school staff with the time, space, and occasions to interact informally with kids. So the step 2 is teaching at the right level. There is mounting evidence that individualization is really the key step for increasing achievement in a rapid way. There are 3 different ways that it can be done. It can be done first by just helping teachers learn how to personalize instruction. The second thing is providing additional personal assistance to students who are struggling. And the third way is to let students learn at their own pace, often on a computer platform. And I'll cover all 3 of those. So one of the keys about teaching at a right level is, especially post-pandemic, students came back to school with very different levels of learning. even though they may have pre-pandemic been more or less the same, how each student got affected during the close downs and lockdowns. It really increased the diversity of individuals' abilities when they came back. So rather than regrouping young people by age, as we typically do, doing assessments and then grouping young people in different subjects based on their ability, so that teachers could target instruction to the right level, it matters a lot. 10 minutes, okay. Say it again. 3 minutes left. Okay. The other thing is to teach in smaller groups. This can either be done with smaller classrooms or individual small group classes teaching within a classroom, and materials that, of course, would support that. Another way, probably the most effective way to do teaching at the right level is intensive individualized tutoring at either like 2 students to 1, where the research is really low, very intensive, with 2 students and 1 tutor, or up to, say, 4 students and 1 tutor. And it happens throughout the school year for really significant periods of time. What is starting to become, to make that's very expensive. To make that affordable, there's emerging research that shows you can sort of substitute some of the in-person tutoring time for computer personalized instruction. So I'll skip that due to time. Again, time, I'm not going to go over 3, but let me just highlight a few things. The most effective tutors are the teachers, but they are also the most expensive. You can get almost 85% of the same learning gains if you have paraprofessionals. So those are non-certified teachers who get taught how to tutor, and they're paid. And those types of individuals, if well trained, can achieve really massive learning gains in their students. The other thing I just want to point out is very important is where it happens. If it happens during the school day, it has much, much bigger effects, like 2 or 3 times as big than if you do it after school or some other time. Mostly because students don't show up on a regular basis, but they do to school. The problem with this, of course, is both where do you find the tutors, the staffing issue, and the cost. I'm going to skip this again for issue of time, but there was a very, very recent paper that covered 5 RCTs in 5 countries where they use cell phones to do a variety of different types of interventions to deliver math instruction. One was very, very simple, which was SMS message text weekly with both numeracy content and some tests, some problems with nudges throughout the week to make sure you'd done the problems. The second version is they added a 20-minute phone call with an individual tutorial during that 20 minutes, once a week, for 8 weeks. And this was tested out, as I said, in 5 different countries. And the bottom line was the SMS alone had kind of mixed, very small impacts, but this 20-minute tutorial delivered by the phone was effective in all 5 countries and at levels that were actually pretty impressive. So you can, in order to, well, let me go back. A way to make reduce costs is by using computer-assisted learning platforms. But they don't all work. And they do, they can work and they can be effective, but they have to, the content has to be tailored to the students and aligned with what's going on in the school day. You can also combine these two things with the very intensive tutoring, where you substitute, as I was saying, you substitute some of the time that you meet in person with computers instruction. And here, this was a kind of an early test of this concept. So there was a very well-known intervention that paired 2 students with one tutor daily throughout the whole year. And the dark part is how much a typical high school student in that school would learn. And the addition, you can see it more than doubled, this 2-to-1 tutoring more than doubled it. To make it cheaper, they said, well, what if every other day they meet with a tutor, and the other days, the off days, they'll work on a computer platform. The impact was almost the same, and it cut the cost by 1/3. So that's a very promising way to go. And I'm currently doing an RCT where we're seeing how far we can push that, and we're starting to test 6-to-1 and 8-to-1 versions. So the last thing, and I'm almost done, is expanding learning time. So the types of expanded learning time that seems to be effective are things like a double dose math or reading. So instead of having an hour a day or in math or reading, double that to 2 hours. Maybe not every day, but 3 days a week it might be 2 hours, and the other days it'll be 1 hour. There are things called acceleration camps, which during the time, when school breaks happen, some kids will be asked to go to an acceleration camp, and for a short period of time, there's like a blitz in trying to catch them up in a very individualized way. You can do things like weekend school, you can extend the school day, or extend the school year. However, if all you're doing is extending and not really changing what you do, it turns out that especially extending the school year doesn't do very much. Even extending the school day doesn't do much. I'm going to skip this for the last. This is, how do you extend time and do it in a productive way? There are better ways of doing it in less ways. And I'm done.
Great, thanks very much, Jean. Please give Jean a round of applause, and then we move straight to Q&A. Does anybody have any questions from the floor? Come on, people. Okay, Pak Tony, please. Wait, one is running towards you.
Thank you very much, Mas Daniel. Thank you very much for an insightful presentation. I just have a quick question about the map that you have shown us. There are several countries who benefit from this situation. Is there any specific condition that make them could benefit from the COVID-19 something, about the, learning times or something? I forgot about it, but if I'm not mistaken, there are 2 countries who have a green color. That means they get benefit from that. That's all. Thank you.
Yes. There were a few countries that were neither, I think it was yellow, there was nobody benefited, but there were some countries that were not negatively affected. Really a handful, 3. And those were the countries that didn't close their schools. So there's some countries that decided to keep the schools open since there was medical, early in the beginning we weren't sure, but it looked like kids were not getting sick. And so there were a handful of countries that didn't close schools, or there were countries where, I think it was in Australia, it took a long time for COVID to get there. They basically just closed their borders. And so school continued and didn't close down. So that's the way you didn't get hurt, is if you didn't close your schools.
Okay, great. So because we're a bit pressed against time, there's one more question that I want you to ask. It comes from online. And I think this is very important because in developing countries, there are funding constraints. There are also capability constraints. like you mentioned, schools or education systems that were weaker before COVID was hit harder, but that also means when you ask them to do teaching at the right level, extend learning time and all these things, they might not have the capability or the finances to do it. So how can these countries prioritize? Maybe if you can say something very quickly about that.
Yeah, exactly. So as I was preparing this talk, I thought, it's just saying, the bottom line is spend more money, right? And yet, so I think there are two things that I would take away from, this was a review of the literature, and one is cheaper things will not have as positive effect as more expensive ones, but doing something is better than nothing. So, maybe you can only afford the least effective option in all of those things. That's better than not doing anything. The other part is more for the national leaders, is if you're really trying to make an investment in the future of your economy, maybe you need to spend more on the education system at the moment because it's been hit, and you're going to have to put more money. So it is both a call to have more money for the educational system in general, which is hard to get, but even doing cheap things is better than doing nothing.
Okay, great. So with that, please join me in thanking Professor Grossman again. And thank you very much. Our second speaker is Dr. Gok Sunju from Skills Future Singapore. So please, yes, let's clap.
Yep, thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me at this important discussion. In fact, I was attracted by this panel's title about how do we prepare our countries, various economy for future skilling. I think that's an important topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you what we think as important to have a responsive and resilient skill ecosystem. And I will unpack that a little bit at a time. And more importantly is what are the lessons that we all can learn from each other through this building out of this ecosystem. Okay. I think as we all know about the pandemic issues, and every country, this is one of the once-in-a-lifetime experience that really shocked everybody. And during that period of time, I think every country was trying to frantically securing all the necessary medical devices, protective gears, including vaccinations, not to talk about food sources, because all the countries, a lot of productions are shut. And we all learned that it is very important to have a responsive and resilient system based on supply chains to healthcare system, and so be it for food sources, material, and community. But equally important is, are we ready in an economy to be able to respond quickly and in a resilient manner similarly for education system and lifelong learning system? As Jean earlier on talked about the disruptions, the time that are out of the classroom, the time that people stop learning, it has a detrimental effect later on in life. So I think I have a little chart here. I can't compare that with Jean. Jean has a very comprehensive system. But typically is we must learn from this lesson is how can we not stop learning during disruptions, be it climate change, be it the next pandemic to come. How can we learn from this lesson and have build a system that will be able to withstand what to come and not to shut schools, not to shut lifelong learning system. We can talk about that later on about how Singapore has done it. But during the pandemic, we have actually ramped up in Singapore to ensure that the cohorts graduating from the year 2020, 21, and 22 are not disrupted. The employment is not disrupted. So we go around to create learning opportunity with company to host our graduates. And this is very important because the high coordination is needed, but you can read about it in, you just Google SG United Job and Skills, you can see the full suite of programs and the people behind it that rally to ensure nobody stops learning and nobody get out of jobs. They actually, if they're just fresh grad and they can't get a job, at least they minimally has a place to continue learning as an extended internship. Yeah. So I think let's talk about how important it is to have a resilient and responsive education and lifelong learning system. And to build that, to be very honest, we cannot be just looking at pandemic as a one-off kind of disruptions. In fact, technological disruption is coming, and digitalization, as we mentioned, are all changing the way we work and changing the way skills are deployed. So the more we need to think beyond that and think about the future economy and plan ahead of time and ask ourselves, what kind of skills does our people need, and how can we make sure that they are ready for the future? So that requires the kind of consolidated or coordinated efforts. And here I put forth the 3 circles is look at future economy, look at future of work, and also equally important is the kind of economic social policy we want to put in place, because every country would like to say that if the economic growth must benefit our citizens, how are we going to go about doing that in all segments of the workforce, in all segments of populations? And about better educations, can everybody get it? And the kind of technological innovations, can we spread across? Because we talk about skills bias, innovations, and then the wage dispersion that we're going to see, or actually already seeing, how can we close the gap? And aging population, another one. So all this require very careful coordinations to be able to respond to the kind of challenges coming. And this is a very small slide, but basically it's a responsive and resilient system, ecosystem must be able to, at the upstream, identify the kind of job and skills we need, then able to translate it, I would say, at speed, at scale, at the supply side, which is can the university, can the polytechnic actually quickly activate and update their curriculum and plan for prepare the people for the future, and then able to rally the workforce to come for training. And this is not easy because people tend not to want to come for training because if they can't see the future very fast, but how can we activate on the ground and also motivate or incentivize company to send their staff for training? And lastly, is really monitoring the outcome. And all this has to be ongoing all the time. And this requires a lot of stakeholders coming together. And I cannot emphasize more about high level of coordination needed at national level, sectoral level, regional level, all need to come together to strengthen that nexus between skills supply and skills demand. An employer on the demand side must be able to stand forward and signal what they needed. And then the supply side is, can the people come together and say that, okay, I can go ahead and train for the skills I need. And that coordinations and somebody has to be the convener. So early on, I was, in this morning, have a breakfast with some of the Indonesian counterpart. We are just talking about, as a country so large like Indonesia, you may need to really go to the local setting, regional, city setting, to do that kind of coordination and planning to be more effective, because the activation is faster. You can quickly see the result than to coordinate far away from for the center. So some very quick pointer about the kind of critical success factor needed for a responsive and resilient skill ecosystem to function. Of course, the clarity of policy priority is very important. Are you preparing the policy priority is the future, or the priority is now in certain regions, in certain economy? For example, you're going to green transitions. What about people currently working in the mining industry? Can we really transit them into something else? So I think the policy priority is very important. Secondly is the ownerships. Who owns the or co-ownerships of job skills demand and supply matching? Who really owns it? Is it the trade association and chambers locally, or is it sectorial agency, or is it central government, or is it a joint effort? Like in Singapore, we believe in tripartism. So the union, the government, the employer groups, and also the Institute of Higher Learning, the education sector, must everybody come in and co-own. And third is about the quality of training in institution and adult educator, which I'll share later. And sustainable sources of funding is fundamental, because you cannot have disruptions if you want the system to continue. So this is fundamental. And the capability and trust among the stakeholders is key. So I will share later on over the year how we build the capability of our stakeholder. And investment in research, R&D is super important, not just in education and learning, but also about, for example, career coaching, about how R&D can take place so that the R&D can translate into practical applications in the workplaces. Learning technology is very important to deploy. Jean earlier on talked about the kind of platform. I think we really require the LearnTech to give analytics to educators to understand. And like as I mentioned earlier on, the tripartite partnership is key. So very quickly, because this deck outside will be given to you, so I just screen through very quickly. Yeah? So earlier on in Singapore, we started with we see a problem, we design a program. So it was programmatic interventions. But we realized that it's not going to be sustainable because if we want a system at the system level able to respond to each time that there's a challenge or crisis to come, we need the system to be very resilient. So we need to know which partner we need to build in order to be able to, over time, be able to learn along the system and be more stronger each time. And then sustainable financing is super important, regardless of good time, bad time. The committed funding must go into the right place, right location, right program, and right level of research. So we must make sure that sustainable financing will be there, and we need to expand all the time the approach towards how we want to build, we call it Skill Future as a movement to be a collective effort that everybody co-owns and not just owned by the government. And over time, we have built 3 pillars of continuing education and training in Singapore. Institute of Higher Learning, University, Polytechnic continue to be very strong, important partners, but likewise, a private sector, and more importantly, over the last couple of years, we are bringing in employers to be the locations of training. That means employer, workplaces, big company must be able to train beyond their staff, to train extensively and release trained workforce into the market. So that requires us to really cajole and bring the partners willing to work with us. And invest in adult educator, as I mentioned on. In Singapore, we have one of the best national institute of education that trains teachers. Likewise, we also invest in setting up Institute for Adult Learning to continuously train our adult educators. And the adult educators are a mixed group of professional. Sometimes most of the time they are working, but we want them to volunteer their time or offer their time to come and teach the next generation workforce. So we need to equip them with fundamental andragogical understandings and also willing to impart their knowledge and bring their experience to the future workforce. And that requires a lot of recognition and incentive and also pumping in research. So you can read more about how we set up Institute for Adult Learning to drive this as a commitment and in also driving research. We leverage a lot on data now, big data, to look into what are the how are jobs changing. Even before the trend can hit Singapore, we must be able to anticipate. For example, if we really want to go into green hydrogens, what kind of workforce, what kind of engineer do we need, what kind of skill set do we need, who in the workforce today already have some of the skill set, who can bridge over the skill set very quickly. So leveraging on labor market data set will be very important, and combining the data set with administrative data to help us to be able to measure and then predict and share the information across, we call job skill insight, with all the key partners is very key. And this is, again, is not just today, but continuously to strengthen every single partner within the ecosystem. So we invest a lot in building up now what we call a Queen Bee network of huge company able to train their their value chain of small, medium enterprises. This is a very good program, it's very successful. We also trying to build out our skills development partners across industry by professional groups, by trade association and chambers in different domains so that we can mobilize and activate the whole reskilling at speed. So this is my very last slide. Future skills in practice, like I mentioned, there are 8 points here. I think you can read on your own. But what I want to highlight a couple of things. One is we need high level of coordination across the key partners, and that is key. And then we need to see who is really want to own the agenda of reskilling, upskilling, and building up the skill ecosystem. And I personally find that point number 8 is very important about being mindful of the barriers to reskilling and upskilling, because not all workforce, everybody in the workforce, have equal access. Some are less able than the others, so we need to watch over who is being left behind and pay attention to that. As I mentioned, and then the kind of investment we needed across. Some will be investing for the future, some is really just will help them build up today. And in Singapore, it's very important for the first point is we believe strongly in human capital development, because in order to have everybody have a good share of economic growth, then everybody must be skilled enough to take advantage of that. So with that, I will pause here and welcome questions.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sunju, for a very nice overview of the approach that Singaporean government is doing. Do you have any questions? Yes, please. Please also introduce yourself and where you're from. Thank you.
My name is Arfan Sahib from Presidential Advisory Council of Indonesia. My question for Sunju is looking at Singapore, because I've been in Singapore and see that they got a very good program of AI Singapore. They democratize AI education for all stages of citizens, including the pensioners or housewives. It's really affordable and accessible to all citizens of Singapore. And looking at the statistic of Singapore as the most highest readiness rank, according to Oxford Insight, in Asia, where China 4 levels below. Just wonder what is the role of Singapore would play in the future to expand this AI education into wider area, to beyond Singapore and going into ASEAN as a whole, and therefore expanding the quality of ASEAN marketplace and workforce to be more competitive at the global market. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Arfan. Arfan is my LKY School of Public Policy senior fellow with me in the same batch. Thanks for the questions. Yeah, I would say that today the capability we built in our skill ecosystem, be it EdTech, education tech provider, learn tech providers, or even skills tech providers like JobTech, JobCrack, Salary Board, they are already going across to ASEAN to offer the services to different countries. So it is important they use Singapore as a test bed, and they move across to ASEAN to offer that. So I think at any one time, all these providers are ready to serve. I believe some of them already in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, they are everywhere. So I thought it's quite important that they use Singapore as a test bed, develop the products and ready to offer. Yeah, I think it's already there. Thanks, Afan.
Great, thanks very much. Rashesh? Just wait, it's coming.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rashesh Shrestha from Area. My question is, you mentioned about working together with companies and private sector to support sort of the on-the-job training. Of course, I think one of the key challenges there is the sort of whether the private sector firms have incentive to train their workers, right? Of course, it's important because they are the ones at the forefront of all the changes that are happening in the technology, and they are the ones adopting technology. They understand what kind of skills they would need going forward, and therefore make the decisions. But the challenge is that, I mean, they might have incentives just lay off workers and adopt technology, or like just find people from the market rather than investing in training. So what kind of support does Singapore provide, or incentives does Singapore provide for firms to continue on the job training so that they can actually focus on reskilling the current workers rather than trying to replace them with either technology or other workers?
Yeah, very good questions. Recently, I think about 2 years ago, we started this particular program called National Center of Excellence for Workplace Learning, because we believe that a lot of the authentic learning take place at work. And we want to be able to enable every company, every enterprises in Singapore able to do that. So today we built a network of institutions that are able to go to every company to set up the capability within the firm, able to train their own staff. And today we have about close to 1,000 companies. It's still a small number, but close to 1,000 companies already able to do so. So I think it's quite important for us to want to continue these efforts ongoingly to build supervisors at the workplaces, able to say that I can design work activity at work that I can train up. There are some, of course, sometimes it's pushed up by regulations. For example, we have a progressive wage model that required company to have staff attain certain skill set and then pay certain salary by when. And there are this timeline, and they have to adhere to comply with the timeline, and that give a sense of urgency for the company want to do that on their own, because to train on location is easier to operationalize and bring the staff out of work and send them somewhere else. So these are a couple of things that we've been doing, but it's still early stage, I must say. It takes us a while to see how companies are responding. We also have a Skill Future Enterprise credits, which we give to only eligible small, medium enterprises. No question asked, $10,000. You can use it, deploy to create solutions, to design programs, to train your staff. So that again is another kind of incentive that we put in place to help company.
All right, thanks very much. So for the next one, I would like to invite a female audience to ask a question. It's been men all from the previous one as well. No? No? Okay, Monica, thank you.
Okay, just following up from the previous questions about on-the-job trainings, how do you encourage firms to train, general transferable skills for workers instead of firm-specific skills? And also, how do these incentives for firms change after, like, a higher job turnover in more recent years?
Sorry, the second question, Monica, the second question.
So how do firms' incentives of firms change after they know that there are higher job turnover of their employees in recent years?
Okay,
because if you invest in your employees, but you know that they will try to find a new job after 2 or 3 years, right? You have less incentive to invest in your employees.
Yeah, a good question. So in fact, that reflects what most employers would think of. Number one, your first question is how do we incentivize company to train transferable skills, soft skills? In fact, our statistics shows that when there is a skills gap, the one that is most difficult to train and bridge is soft skills. It is not something simply that you can just send a bunch of people to say, okay, I send you to a class of do critical thinking, and you come back, you can do critical thinking. So we are continuing to do research in this area of how to, when employers think that is the biggest skills gap is soft skills, but the thing is, how do we train soft skills? So last year in our skills demand for future economy reports, we published a brief of the survey outcome. And in fact, the survey outcome shows that the best way to train soft skills is at workplace during work. And it's not a hybrid model, and it's not away from work. That will again go back to require workplaces, supervisors to be assumed as an educator, to think about how can I use work opportunity to train up somebody in terms of communications, in terms of critical thinking, problem solving, is using work activity to do so. And the survey of 3,000 people confirmed that. So I think, again, that requires us to think through how can we enable workplaces to do that, or also require institutions like University Polytechnic who are offering courses to know how can I have a learning design that connect the work practices with what you learn at institution-based. I think there's something we can think about. Quite important to invest more resources in that. Secondly, we have been talking a lot to enterprises about knowing the fact that the churn will be there because of very tight labor market. In fact, across the world, not just in Singapore, very tight labor market is when people will leave when there's a higher salary, they will just move. But at the end of the day is if everybody train your workforce, no matter where they go, the benefit will cycle back to you. But if nobody want to train, then I think that's a problem because you try to poach from each other. So we in Singapore, we try to believe that it is okay to overtrain because at the end, the whole society, the whole economy will benefit. Then one part, of course, individuals, you can invest on your own, in yourself, but one part is employer who know what they need in the company should continue to train, invest the kind of human capital for their workplace. You can see that people will usually come back, or the alumni will be there in the economy. So I think we try to pitch this to the employers group. Not easy. I think the small medium enterprises are less willing to do so than larger enterprises because larger enterprises, they already know what they need in today and tomorrow. They are willing to invest. In fact, they do not mind when you leave. One day you can come back to their workforce. So I think this is still a mindset issue among the enterprises to say that, hey, it's okay, it's all right to invest in every one of us because at the end, it's the tide that rises that will benefit everybody. Not easy.
Okay, thank you. It's a very interesting issue. Any more questions? We still have plenty of time, maybe 5 more minutes. So I have one. So Monica was talking about companies poaching talent from each other, but sometimes countries do that as well, right? For example, that's why countries have skilled migration programs. Many countries around the world, especially developed countries, and they take the skills usually away from the developing countries where skills are already rare, and then they have to move. It's not the people's fault because that's what they do. But do you think there's some sort of, being ASEAN, there should be like a regional approach to make sure that, like you said, all countries can benefit equally because, migration is maybe a faster way to fill a country's skills gap compared to upskilling, especially with the speed of the change, right? What do you think about that?
I think this morning, was it Jean who talked about it, or was it the other speaker who talked about it, that today, if you look at it today, skilled workforce may not need to leave where they live to work for somewhere else. And I think we already, in Singapore and in Indonesia, I believe we already established some kind of economic zone like in Batam, Bintan, where I think that some of the highly skilled Indonesian graduates are working there, and they're serving company that's set up in Singapore. So the kind of private sector informal setup is already there. And so is Singapore company using software engineer because it's not enough from Vietnam or from Jakarta or from Philippines. So I would say that it is not just about the physical talent mobility, but today the platform, the technology allow us to tap on different talents if the talents services can be provided via internet. So I think the mobility is even greater than having the physical person moving there, and the flexibility is there. And I think the private sector is doing it very well. From my perspective, I've seen 3 to 4 companies set up in Singapore, but they're able to say that, how many software engineers do you need? I can bring some from Vietnam, how many from Philippines, how many from Jakarta. They all can serve you because the time zone is about the same. And then you don't have an issue, even a call for a Zoom call with the team overseas. So I thought that arrangement is, interestingly, the businesses already picked up and they're able to do so without having the warm body to move across the border. And I think we should watch over this space to see how we can even enhance and help each other in terms of the skills hinterland, and while not sacrificing their own domestic economic needs. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So final chance for questions. If not, please join me in thanking Sunju.
Thank you so much.
I think it's great. So the third speaker is Dr. Monica Wihardja from ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. She will also speak about this issue and with case studies from Indonesia. Please go ahead, your microphone.
Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to this very important high-level policy dialogue. It's very hard to speak after two extraordinary speakers before me, but let me try. So today I will talk about why and how ASEAN can facilitate learning better, especially in a fast-changing and multifaceted global transformation. So maybe the answers are quite obvious, but I will provide some findings from recent studies on the ASEAN-wide skills landscape. And then I will provide also empirical evidence from Indonesia of why and how Indonesia needs to facilitate learning and reskilling. And then I will draw on some policy recommendations. So ASEAN is facing what I will call triple burden of learning. The first one is rapid technological change that is happening at the vertiginous rate. I think it was mentioned earlier this morning that it took 75 years for the world to have 100 million users, internet users. But it took only 2 months to have 100 million ChatGPT users. The rate of technological diffusion is increasing. And a study by the Oxford Economics and Cisco shows that by 2028, around 6.6 million workers across ASEAN 6 countries could be made redundant. And moreover, 41 of these workers are acutely lacking the IT skills where most job creation will need. 30% of these workers are lacking interactive skills and 25% of them are lacking foundational skills. As you can see from the graph on the left-hand side, this shows the displacement vis-a-vis income effects of new technology scenario. But in summary, this figure shows that the one who will lose the most from new technology scenarios are the low-skilled workers, including elementary workers and skilled agricultural workers. Moreover, developing ASEAN countries must increasingly leapfrog the manufacturing sector from agriculture to secure services sector employment. And this poses a big reskilling challenge. The traditional structural transformations is for workers to move from low-skilled agriculture sector to low-skilled manufacturing sector. But as you can see from the graph on the right-hand side, there will be fewer and fewer jobs created in the manufacturing sector and more jobs created in the high-end services. The second burden of learning is ASEAN aging population. Currently, ASEAN has a very young population. 50% of ASEAN populations is under the age of 30. But starting 2021, the working age population as a share of the total population has decreased over time. That means there will be more dependent population per working age population. And as we all know, the brain's ability to learn from experience also decreases with age. So it will be more difficult to reskill older population. And the third burden of learning is climate change. Climate change affects employment in ASEAN mainly from two channels. The first one is employment changes due to decarbonizations of economic activities. As you can see from the figures on the left-hand side, this is the potential job creation across different sectors in ASEAN countries, and the agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors have significant potentials of green job creation in this region. The second channels of how climate change would affect the labor market is through employment changes due to climate impacts. The ASEAN region is highly vulnerable to heat stress, and the share of working hours lost to heat stress will increase from 2% in 1995 to 3.1% in 2030, or equivalent to 62 million full-time jobs. ASEAN countries also start from a low starting point. As you can see from the graph on the left-hand side, except in Singapore, average children in ASEAN don't really live up to their potentials. The Human Capital Index quantifies the contribution of health and education, including stunting rate, to the productivity of the next generation of workers. For example, average Indonesian kids will only live up to 54% of their full potentials in the future. As you can see from the graph on the right-hand side, also students in most Southeast Asian countries have low performance in their PISA scores, especially in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. Also, in some ASEAN countries, there's a high rate of idle youth. These are the youth who are not in employment, in education, nor training. Indonesia has the highest rate of youth not in employment, education, or training. Around a quarter of Indonesian youth can be considered idle. Only 40% of Indonesian workforce graduated from upper secondary school or above. But only 10% of Indonesian workforce, this is before the pre-employment card program, so around 2019, only 10% of Indonesian workforce ever attended any training, and the rest of the 90% who never attended trainings has reasons of lack of money, time, and information for not attending any trainings. Many firms in ASEAN have difficulties finding workers with the right skills, but relatively few firms in ASEAN train their workers in Southeast Asia. As you can see from the figures on the right-hand side, most of the Southeast Asian countries, most of employers in Southeast Asian countries train their workers at a rate below the OECD average. Where and how ASEAN 6 youth have been acquiring their skills? One of the channels ASEAN 6 youth have been acquiring their skills is by changing jobs. The number one reasons for changing jobs for ASEAN 6 youth, according to ASEAN Youth Survey conducted by the World Economic Forums, is to learn new skills. ASEAN 6 youth want more of on-the-job training and internship. The proportions of the on-the-job training is still low. 81% say internships are either equally important or more important than training in school. There are also perceived skills gaps among ASEAN youth. First of all, ASEAN youth show a strong commitment to lifelong learning and a growth mindset. 52.4% of ASEAN 6 youth believe that they must upgrade their skill constantly. Software design and programming and language skills are two skills ASEAN 6 youth believe are important for the future, but they are not proficient at. Creativity and innovations as well as language skills are placed on top as the most important skills for the future by ASEAN 6 youth, followed by technology use and technology change. More than 1/3 of Indonesian youth want to be entrepreneur. And moreover, 46.4% of ASEAN 6 youth are keen to spend time working overseas. Now let me shift gear and show some empirical evidence from Indonesia. This study is conducted by some of my colleagues and myself, and is funded by Japan Economic Foundation and AREA, and will be published as a project report by AREA. So we look at the heterogeneous impacts of digital transformation and investment on Indonesian labor market. We study whether certified trainings could attenuate skill bias technological change that is evident in Indonesia. Skill bias technological change basically says that the internet premium is higher for more educated workers, widening wage gap. We also study evidence on routine bias technological change, factors that drive routine bias technological change, evolutions and heterogeneous returns of task contents of jobs across different types of workers in Indonesia. And we also study the impacts of digital investment in sectors identified as digital sectors on wages and employment on various types of workers. So built on previous work by some of my World Bank colleagues and myself on the evidence of skill bias technological change, we explore the potential channels that potentially attenuate the skill bias technological change, namely closing the gap of internet premia between high and low educated workers. The tables on the right-hand side shows skill bias technological change that is evident in Indonesia. Basically, the table shows that the internet premium or return to the internet penetration in Indonesia is larger for more educated workers. So in this study, we hypothesized that receiving certified training by workers would have attenuating equality enhancing effects on skill bias technological change. So Daniel told me not to provide any data or methodological details as well as regression results, but you can trust me, I have all the evidence of the findings. But we found that certified trainings could attenuate skill bias technological change in Indonesia. Workers with lower educational attainment, namely primary and lower secondary school, and a certified training, have marginally higher internet premium compared to those with similar educational attainment, but without any certified training. And these effects are muted among workers with higher educational attainment. There's no significant difference in the effect of a certified training among female workers relative to male counterparts. Certified trainings could reduce skill bias technological change among youth workers, but interestingly, this effect is much weaker for older workers. Due to data limitation, we are unable, however, to differentiate whether the training is specific to workers' main occupations or whether the training is to teach digital skills and other related skills. Then we look at routine bias technological change. Unlike skill bias technological change, routine bias technological change theory suggests that low-skilled jobs are not necessarily easily replaced by technologies, but routine jobs are. And these jobs are likely to be middle-skilled jobs, which in turn may create job polarization. We test whether there's evidence of job polarization and factors that might drive it. We also look at the evolutions and returns of task contents of jobs on various types of workers in Indonesia. So the graph on the left-hand side shows occupational shares across time in Indonesia. So after excluding the agriculture sector that might bias the result because of the structural transformation happening in developing countries, we find that at the national level, the share of sales workers decreased during the period of 2001 and 2019, while the share of managerial, professional, and technical workers increased. And these trends are consistent if you look at the data at the provincial level. The shares of clerical workers, production workers, and laborers as well as services workers are relatively still stable. A notable change in the occupational structure started in 2006 when there's a decrease in the share of mid-skill occupations and an increase in the share of low and high-skilled occupations. And the timing when the occupational structure started to polarize coincides with the commodity boom era and premature deindustrialization, which saw a decline in the manufacturing sector and a booming in the low productivity services sector. And based on our regression, we find that more affordable technologies proxied by the cost of memory may be benefiting high-skilled occupations, but may substitute mid-skill occupation, especially clerical and sales occupations. Moreover, better access to workers with tertiary education could lead to a higher share of high-skilled jobs. In addition, changes in economic structural transformation, such as the share of the manufacturing GDP during the commodity boom marked by premature deindustrialization, may indeed contribute to job polarization. And now let's look at the evolutions of task contents of jobs in Indonesia. So we match task contents of jobs with occupations in Indonesia. The graph on the left-hand side shows the evolutions of task contents of jobs in Indonesia. Occupations in Indonesia are still dominated by manual task contents, but manual task contents decrease over time. Digital task contents, as you can see from the purple line on the left-hand side graph, increased drastically between 2001 and 2015. Using a cross-correlation matrix, we study the complementarity and substitutability of digital task contents of jobs with other task contents. And we find that digital task contents is complementary to non-routine cognitive analytical, non-routine cognitive interpersonal, and routine cognitive, but is a substitute to routine manual and non-routine manual physical. And this supports our hypothesis that digital technology may replace jobs with high routine or manual content. We then study the heterogeneous wage returns of task contents across different segments of the population, including by gender, rural, urban, age groups, and years of education. But in summary, digital task contents have higher returns for traditionally disadvantaged groups of workers, namely female, workers from rural areas, older workers, and also workers with lower education. And this provides potential opportunities to increase their wages and to increase their productivity by increasing digital task contents in their jobs. Next, we look at the impacts of investment in sectors identified as digital sectors on wages and employment on various types of workers. We hypothesize that digital investment has heterogeneous impacts on different types of workers. First, we use the definition from UNSD and OECD to define digital sectors. And we break down digital sectors into three categories, namely digital manufacturing, digital trade, and digital services. And we found that digital manufacturing investment has a heterogeneous impact on wages across income quintiles, favoring high-income workers, as you can see from the graph on the top right-hand side. Digital trade and service investment show no significant impacts on wages across different income distribution. Interestingly, investment in the digital sector tend to increase wage inequality. On average, in terms of the impacts on employment, general new investment projects increase total employment by around 0.2% in Indonesia, but digital manufacturing and trade investment reduce employment. Negative impacts of digital manufacturing investment affect female, low-educated youth, and elder workers, as well as blue-collar workers, both low and high-skilled blue-collar workers the most. Blue-collar, low-skilled workers include mostly factory workers, as well as elementary services workers. Blue-collar, high-skilled workers include workers such as electrical installers and repairers. Negative impacts on digital trade appears to hit, in terms of employment, appears to hit mostly female, low-educated elder workers, and low-skilled white-collar workers. And these white-collar, low-skilled workers include or consist mainly of clerical workers and services workers. In summary, the overall narrative is quite clear. Workers who are more advantaged to begin with, such as high-skilled and better educated workers, are more likely to benefit from digital transformation and digital investment, while low and mid-skilled as well as lower educated workers are more likely to be potential losers. Although there are cases when high-skilled and better educated workers could also lose from digital transformation and digital investment. Our analysis, however, cannot say about the impacts of new and emerging digital technologies post-2019, such as generative AI, that we see evolving at a very fast rate. Contrary to what we find in our analysis, a study shows that generative AI actually exposes highly educated, highly paid, white-collar workers to job losses. Hence, different digital technologies may have different impacts on the labor market that we need to continuously monitor. Now, I will draw on some of the policy recommendations and throw some of my thoughts. First is the bread and butter public policy. Improve educational outcomes, both enrollment and quality, and facilitate learning, including by providing support to at-risk students to ensure they complete at least high school. Second, support the development of and access to certified online distance learning, including from TVET programs for adult workers. Third, revise curriculum and pedagogical methods to teach non-routine interpersonal, analytical, and digital skills to students and adult learners. Fourth, improve the quality of training system by prioritizing the development of quality assurance mechanism and by more effectively engaging the private sectors. And fifth, incentivize firms to do on-the-job training and internship programs while encouraging workers to take self-development trainings. And sixth, monitor potential winners and losers from specific digital technological change and target potential losers for reskilling programs. I'm going to throw some of my thoughts that might not be directly related to the evidence that I talked earlier, but I use this phrase that a frog that in the well doesn't see the big ocean. I see the importance of students' exchange and workers' exchange across ASEAN countries. Spending time studying and working overseas may be a valuable strategy for workers and youth or students to learn new skills, expand their knowledge, learn different cultures. Some of ASEAN countries, especially Thailand, for example, is facing a really serious aging populations. And soon they will need to accept more immigrants and maybe use technologies to fill in their labor shortage. And it's very important, I think, for students and workers to be able to move countries more easily. And therefore, students and workers exchange programs and relevant visa programs could be encouraged. More mutual recognition agreements on skills and qualification could be promoted. And as talents become scarcer, especially with aging population, motivations to reskill will also depend on whether people have opportunities to work in countries that offer the best incentives. Hence, agreement of movement of natural persons will be key. So another some of my thoughts that I will throw also here is to change some of our mindset. First, that like education, reskilling is investment, not expenditure. But it's really hard to see reskilling as investment when you have a short political cycle. And second, put the best people to educate with competitive salaries, not those who cannot get a job. In Singapore, for example, only the top 30% of graduates can teach in public schools. And for teachers to teach more fluid intelligence instead of crystallized intelligence. In many ASEAN countries, most of learnings is still done by memorizing, for example. So teach less, empower more, so that students can learn more. Also, I think because of the globalized world, it's important to teach the values of diversity. In schools, I think students need to be taught to be one of a kind instead of one of them. That could also teach more creativity and creative skills. Offer diverse learning for diverse abilities, as Professor Jinori talked about earlier about individualized and personalized learning, for example, and to teach that there are multiple pathways to success, including through entrepreneurship. And avoid knee-jerk reaction. Instead, change should be done also in steady manner. Today we are hit by coronavirus, but tomorrow we might be hit by a computer virus. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Monica. Okay, so that's a lot of content, very comprehensive. Comments, questions? Yes. Please tell us your name and where you're from.
Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Monica. My name is Wihardja. I'm currently a student at Institut Teknologi Bandung. So what I would like to ask is maybe about the condition of the disadvantaged workers. So maybe as we have seen from your research, the continued trends of digital investments have polarized jobs. And maybe in the context of Indonesia, we're seeing that there's a demographic bonus coming ahead, and it would be a massive it would be a massive opportunity cost if we didn't try to put some focus on upskilling these disadvantaged workers. And while there are some optimistic metrics, as you've shown, like lifelong learning, a growth mindset, the desire to become an entrepreneur, and etc., I've seen that maybe on the field, these metrics might not be as optimistic because there's maybe this friction or this comfortability with complacency that is quite apparent, especially in disadvantaged communities or workers, which might be represented by, for example, the metrics on idle youth, which was a staggering 20-something% for Indonesia. And so my question is, maybe on a policy level, how could we encourage a sense of urgency to upskill within the disadvantaged communities themselves? Because we can't let them simply be punished or wait for changing times to give them this sense of urgency. Or maybe to put it simpler, how does changing mindsets look like in policy, especially for these disadvantaged communities? Thank you.
Yeah, it's very good questions, and I might not have the best answers at hand. But I agree that we need to create a sense of urgency when it comes to talents. I just come back from Japan, and I see a huge shortage of talents and human resources there. And Japan has been talking about its aging population 30 years ago. And right now, due to slow to progress immigration policies and disinclinations to accept migrants, now Japan is facing a huge labor shortage, including in the ICT skills. I mean, in the ICT sectors. And due to a weakening yen and the stagnant economy as well as stagnant wage growth, now it's even more difficult for Japan to attract talents from outside, even from Southeast Asian countries. So the relative wage, for example, for Japanese workers vis-a-vis Vietnamese workers will continue to decrease. And Japan will face even more difficult challenge to attract workers from Southeast Asian countries. But this is perhaps an extreme example. But this basically shows the urgencies of countries to start really attract talents and open as wide as possible talents from other countries. Many ASEAN countries have a very progressive immigration policies to attract talents, right? For example, Singapore has special visa and incentive for ICT specialists. They provide, instead of 1 year employment visa, they provide 2 years employment visa plus, I think, some other financial incentives. But you can see that talents are becoming scarcer, and almost all countries in the world now try to attract talents. So hopefully, ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, will open their eyes and will wake up to the fact that talents will become very scarce. So there's an urgency to have progressive immigration policies, but also, as already mentioned by Daniels and then also Professor Jin in the plenary session this morning, I think the online freelance workers will become very important, and this is a space to watch. It's really amazing that Bangladesh is now providing 14% of the online intermediate services, for example. But immigration policy can be a very sensitive domestic issues, as we've seen around the world, including in Japan. Japan is a very homogeneous society. It's very difficult to accept people or workers from different race. But with these online freelance workers, a country can fill in their labor shortages. So this is really like a space to watch.
Okay. Any more questions? Pak Asep, please.
Thank you. I am Asep Suryadarma from Semeru Research Institute. Thank you, Monica, for a very comprehensive presentation. I'm thinking that usually when we think about worker and skill, we will think that a worker will have a specific skill, working in a specific occupation, doing one specific job. Yeah. However, we're now doing a study looking at the impact of the pandemic on labor demand by firms. Yeah. So we interviewed several companies and
on
also
what, Pak? Study on what, Pak Asep?
looking at the impact of labor demand by firms. Yeah. So we have interviewed some companies and also some employer association. So some of our respondents have said, when we asked them what have changed, they said, so in the past we will look at one person to do one specific job. But now when we recruit, we look for people who have multiple skills. So for example, in a hotel industry, we are looking for a person who can, in the morning, supervise the cleaning services workers. Later on, he or she will do some administrative work. Then during the midday, when it's busy with the clients, with the guests, they will have to become the consumer representative, accepting guests who are checking out and checking in. And later on, late in the afternoon, he or she will have to do some accounting works. Yeah. So in the past, the hotel will have to hire 4 workers to do that, but now 1 worker will have to do all the 4 jobs. Do you think this is a fundamental change in the labor market, or it's just what you said as the knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic? I'm curious with your thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as a researcher, I hope I don't have to do like cleaning task. But I mean, I don't have like immediate answers or evidence on that. But I guess what I'm observing is that even from my personal experience, you do need to have skills to learn, basically, right? Skills to learn new tasks. But I mean, I think there's a trade-off in terms of productivity when one person has to do just one task versus one person has to do like multiple tasks, right? I think there's some study that basically shows human actually cannot do like cannot do multiple tasking, and for me, I don't know. It's not quite ideal to have like workers to do like cleaning services in the morning and then customer service in the afternoon. That's kind of like a lot of work for a worker, for employees. But my questions earlier to Dr. Sunju is that, you know, I think transferable skills is important. Learning skills that are transferable across jobs and across industries and sectors, I think it's key for workers to have high job mobility and to be able to have a job upgrading as well. But I'm not sure if it's like having or doing like multiple tasks and not being like specific in terms of doing tasks at a time, or doing one specific job at a time will be a good idea. But this is a very interesting findings, and I would love to see more of these findings.
Okay, yes. Please, if you can make it, you know, short and to the point, and also introduce yourself.
All right, okay, thank you. My name is Rio. I'm from Universitas Gadjah Mada. My main question is actually, in your research, do you have any finding or hints that if a worker trained in a certain ICT skills can provide more jobs mobility, maybe moving from one company to another, maybe not necessarily in the same field, but in the same industry, but within using the same skills? Thank you. Or Bahasa Indonesia?
What kind of ICT skills will allow workers to do different jobs?
What kind of ICT skills?
Right?
No.
Question, right?
I mean, if a worker has been trained in a certain ICT skills, maybe programming or web developing, does in your research have any finding or hints that worker can have more job mobility from moving from one company to another, something like that?
I don't have the answer from Indonesia, but I get to listen to a talk by Chief Digital Officers of Cosmo Energy. It's a big energy company in Japan. And according to her, data analytics is like a skills that is like transferable across companies and sectors and industries. So that's one skills that is like basically transferable across like firms and sectors and industries. She only mentioned about data analytics. She didn't mention about any other types of ICT skills. But I think when you already have like knowledge and skills on data analytics, I think it's quite easy to upgrade these skills, right? To like, let's say, like more advanced digital or more advanced computational task and other jobs. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have questions on the internet? I see one here, but I want to see another one. No? There's only one? Okay. Okay, this is a good one. So there's a question from our online participant. So it says that Monica's research shows that digital trade appears to negatively impact female workers. But on the other hand, digitalization can reduce women's barrier to entry and re-entry into the workforce. So how do you make sure, as a, for policymakers, to make sure that digitalization will benefit women or improve their labor market outcomes?
Yeah, according to my recent study together with Shopee, so we had the COVID-19 digital merchants surveys, surveying digital merchants on Shopee platform, show that time barriers for women merchants is important. They want to spend more on trading on e-commerce platforms, but they lack time due to household responsibilities. So making sure there's accessible and affordable, high quality childcare services will be key for women and to unlock potentials for women in the digital economy, but also other policies that could be improved in terms of financial incentive, like access for women to credits, as well as access to women for reskilling and upskilling, to use digital platforms and to do work on digital platforms or in other sectors in digital economy. So perhaps these three things: one is more affordable, more accessible childcare service, high quality childcare service for women. Second is financial access to credits and other financial incentives. And third, access to upskilling and reskilling.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're out of time, so please join me in thanking Monica again for her presentation and all the research. So before I let you go, I have two reminders. One, all the material is available online, so you scan your QR code. And two, don't forget to fill the evaluation form, because we seriously want to hear your feedback so we can improve this event in the future. So even if you're not enticed by e-certificates, please fill the evaluation form. So is there anything else? That's it? Okay, so with that, thank you again for joining this session. And yeah, see you guys next time. Bye.